Thank you, Isla, for reading and leading this morning. So, the scripture shows us one thing, if nothing else. We are not the first people to shelter in place. If we look at what the disciples have done, it is literally a sheltering in place after the death of Jesus. Sometimes I think we're a little quick to call things unique or to act like we're the first ones to go through it. It's that whole prisoner of the moment thing. And we can sometimes lose perspective or sometimes even elevate our experience into some tragedy of historic proportions even before it reaches that point. We are getting to that point. This is a pandemic that will mark history for many. But many of us have been blessed to live it in a sense of privilege. And the beauty of community, the beauty of the disciple story is that none of them had to do it alone. And we know that as we go through this experience, whatever it's going to lead us into, we are not having to go through this alone. We're not the first people to face a pandemic, not the first to struggle with the unknown. We're not the first people to shelter in place. In times of war, our students with school lockdowns, and those who've ridden out storms all across the country, shelter in place is a term we've come to know, and it's a term that evokes different emotions. But none of these emotions are new. We've been there before. In the past, this congregation has done a good bit of study and conversation around trauma resilience and trauma healing, exploring how we as humans respond to traumatic events in our lives. The first thing we may remember is that our physical response is the first thing, how our bodies kick in. We've talked before about fight or flight instincts, that physical response to either run away or to go tackle a problem head on. But shelter in place is really neither one. No one's running into the face of COVID-19 with a bottle of Lysol and a flimsy mask like Don Quixote challenging the windmills. We know that's a futile task. But we're not running away either. We're not heading up to the mountains or trying to get on boats and get to private beaches. We're staying in our communities. In many ways, we are neither fighting or taking flight, but doing that third activity that we talked about in our trauma, fight, flight, or freeze. We often talk about freeze as something that comes out of helplessness, when we don't think it'll make a difference to run away or to fight. It brings up strange emotions to think that we're doing nothing, that our response doesn't matter. It's a strange response, this doing nothing, this sheltering in place. But that's exactly what it looks like the disciples are doing when confronted with the death of Jesus. When confused by the story of his resurrection, it looks like they're sheltering in place, doing nothing. Maybe they're hiding. Maybe they're avoiding. Scripture goes as far as to tell us that they were there out of fear. They were there out of fear. They're not sure what's happening politically. They're not really sure what this post-Jesus reality is going to be like. Sure, they've heard the stories. Some of them have even seen an empty tomb. But what comes next? What comes next is an unknown, and it can be exhausting. I think we've all felt it at some point. It wreaks havoc on our bodies as we sit in our fight or flight energy. We just sit in it, unable to do much with it. It wreaks havoc on our emotions as well. It worries us into exhaustion. Our worry about the future, our worry about loved ones, our worry about what will be the same, about what people are missing, about what we're not being told, our worries about how leaders are handling this situation and possibly making it worse. There is not enough sleep. There is not enough good TV. There is not enough scientific information to set our fears aside, to deal with the fight or flight energy that builds up within us. There's not enough of anything to ease our weary minds, hearts, and bodies. The disciples had to feel the same, right? The days leading up to Jesus' death had been eventful. They had been a roller coaster ride. The years with Jesus had been a roller coaster, ups and downs, fears, narrow escapes, amazing highs, frightening lows. It had not been easy. But now they were facing an unknown, without the buffer of Jesus. They were facing the future on their own. So they sheltered in place. Over the years, I think we may have been a little hard on the disciples. We've picked on their lack of action. We've judged their need to hide. And we've piled on poor Thomas for doing the same thing that all the other disciples did when Jesus first appeared. Heck, he seems to be the only person in the group designated as an essential worker. I'm not sure what he was going off to do. Maybe he was just on the grocery run. But in this shelter-in-place moment, Thomas is the only one who's not there with everybody else. Maybe he's the one that knew where they had toilet paper for sale. I don't know. But he's not with them at the first. But his interaction with Jesus is the same as the others as they shelter in place. Over the years, we've been really hard on the disciples. But what if they aren't truly frozen in their response? What if they're not just fearful, but also patient? What if they're also patient? What if they're not truly hiding, but really sheltering in place? What if they're simply waiting to see what the best course of action is? Praying, talking, eating, reflecting, catching up on a book, healing wounds among them, dealing with the issues within their community, telling stories, remembering. What if they are sheltering in place, simply waiting on Jesus? Well, it happens. They wait and Jesus shows up. Even a locked room, even clouded in the midst of fears, Jesus finds a way in. Jesus shows up, and he doesn't seem mad. As much judgment as we throw on the disciples, Jesus isn't mad at them. He says, "Peace be with you." He gives them the gift of his peace. He wishes good for them. He projects and prophesies the future where they're leading and healing others and forgiving sins. He comes back later and repeats the same shtick for Thomas. He makes sure that everybody knows what he's talking about. He suggests that others will believe without seeing. And that covers all of them, not just Thomas. And it doesn't have to be read as judgy, and it can really be read as prophetic. We are the ones who have believed without seeing. We're that living church that grew out of the courage and faith of the first disciples. We're the heirs to their story. So what have we learned? Maybe it's to shelter in place. To stop and imagine what's really going on. To stop and prepare ourselves for what comes next. To stop and spend time renewing our hearts and our minds. To stop and wait for Jesus. Even in our fretful nights, Jesus can show up. Even in our angry restlessness, Jesus can show up. Even in our confusion and paranoia, Jesus can show up. So for now, we shelter in place to take care of ourselves and take care of loved ones. We shelter in place and find a time for renewal and for growth. We shelter in place till we see what comes next. Then we will be ready for it. Amen.